How did each state vote relative to the rest of the country in the 1988 presidential election? That's what we're going to find out today. We'll go through each state and see if they voted to the left or the right of the national popular vote. There's not going to be a spreadsheet in this video, it's just going to be the map. So first, we've got to get our background information. Let's pull up 1988. This was the third consecutive win for the Republicans. Vice President George H.W. Bush won his only term with a big 426 electoral votes out of 40 states. That's a landslide, and it was worth 53.4% of the popular vote. The loser was Governor of Massachusetts Michael Dukakis for the Dems. He finished with 111 electoral votes out of 10 states plus D.C., and that was worth 45.7%. So to get our baseline, we're looking at the difference between Bush and Dukakis, and that number in favor of Bush is 7.7%. So any state that voted for Bush by more than that is relatively redder. Anything less than that, or for Dukakis, is relatively bluer. So if we get onto the map, and this is actually the 1988 electoral map, we can go alphabetically. We'll start with Alabama. That state was won by Bush with 59.2%. Dukakis got 39.9%. That's a 19.3% margin for Bush, way above the 7.7% national margin. So the difference between 19.3 and 7.7 means Alabama was relatively more Republican by 11.6%. So that's how this works. Now we can quickly fill out the rest of this map. Alaska was similar. It was also redder by 15.6. Arizona was also right in that ballpark at 13.6. Arkansas a little less so at 6.5. In California, that state voted for Bush, but it was only by 3.5. This is the first state that was relatively more Democratic, and that margin is 4.2%. In Colorado, this state voted almost perfectly in line with the entire country. It was at 7.8% for Bush. That's just 0.1% more Republican. Connecticut was to the left by 2.6. Delaware was to the right by 4.7. Florida was 10 points more in that direction by 14.7. Georgia a little less at 12.6. Hawaii, super blue state, Dukakis won it, and it was more Democratic by 17.2. Idaho was a little more than that in the opposite direction at 18.4. Illinois a little bit bluer at 5.6. Indiana was relatively redder at 12.4. Iowa relatively a lot bluer at 17.9. Kansas redder at 5.5. Kentucky 3.9. Louisiana 2.5. And Maine 3.7. The first district was 4.9 and the second was 2.3. Then we've got Maryland. This state was relatively bluer at 4.8. Massachusetts was Dukakis' home state. Not a surprise it was relatively bluer by a big 15.5, but it was still not the bluest state on here. We'll come back to that in a second. In Michigan, barely any difference here, just 0.2% redder. Minnesota, a lot bluer at 14.7. Mississippi, redder at 13.1. Missouri, a big battleground state back then, that was relatively bluer by 3.8. Montana, 2% less at 1.8. Nebraska was GOP friendly at 13.3. Nevada, the exact same percentage. New Hampshire, a little more than that at 18.5. New Jersey, same direction but less than that at 5.9. New Mexico voted to the left by 2.7. New York, way more than that at 11.8. But then it was more Republican in North Carolina at 8.6. North Dakota, 5.3. Ohio, 3.1. And Oklahoma, 8.9. Oregon, double digits bluer at 12.4. Pennsylvania, also bluer at 5.4. And Rhode Island, that was relatively the bluest state on here. It came in at 19.4% more Democratic. Then in South Carolina, that was 16.2% toward the Republicans. South Dakota was a little bit bluer at 1.3. Tennessee, moderately redder at 8.6. Texas comes in redder at 4.9. Utah was the state that was relatively the reddest, and also the state that had the highest percentage out of all of them. They voted to the right of the country by a massive 26.4. Vermont was a little bluer at 4.1. Virginia, double digits redder, 11.8. Then it's bluer in Washington at 9.3. West Virginia, 12.4. Wisconsin, 11.3. And Wyoming comes in redder at 14.8. Then it's Washington, D.C., of course, way more Democratic at 76.1. So that's it. That's the entire map for 1988. And again, this is the 88 electoral map. Back then, Maine is still split up their electoral votes, but in Nebraska, no longer the case. So if we look at the top, electoral votes in states that voted to the right of the country totaled 286. States that voted to the left were 252. So it's close, but Republicans here with the edge. Now going back several decades, there's always going to be a few exceptions, but much of the map kind of resembles what we're familiar with today. today. We've got the blue West Coast and much of the blue Northeast. The Rust Belt states are all over the place. Wisconsin, dark blue. Michigan, barely red. And Pennsylvania, moderately blue. Plus West Virginia and Iowa are also dark red. That's completely different than today. Missouri was a big bellwether state back then. Colorado was voting red. And Montana and South Dakota, clearly red states, but not as overwhelming as the national vote for Bush. Vermont also not the dark blue state it is today. That, along with other blue states like Maryland and Connecticut, they voted only a little bit to the left of the country, while New Jersey and Delaware voted to the right. New Hampshire is dark red, and Rhode Island even voted further to the left than Dukakis' home state and neighboring Massachusetts. Clearly, Bush had a relatively very limited appeal in that state. So these kinds of maps always end up looking a little quirky. Certain states go in unexpected directions, but you do have much of the Deep South in dark red. And the thing I always like to take note of are the states that voted almost the same as the country. That's Michigan and Colorado, almost an identical margin to the popular vote. So even though Bush won a huge 40 states, including a bunch of blue ones, many of those margins were not convincing. That's why the states voted to the left and they're shaded in blue. There's always more you could talk about with the candidates and the issues at the time and why certain states voted one way or the other compared to other similar states. That's a whole separate topic, but if you wanted to know just how each state voted relative to the rest of the country in 1988, this is the map right here. So let me know in the comments. What do you think about any of this data or this map? Are you surprised North and South Dakota went in opposite directions? What about Delaware or New Mexico? What about any of these other states that are in dark blue or in light red? Let me know why you think that happened or what you're taking a look at down below on your way out. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Join if you'd like to support the channel. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.